Welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show. Nice to be back with y'all. This is a show sponsored by the Future of Freedom Foundation. And if you're watching this show live on Saturday night, 7 to 8 p.m., nice to be here with you. Or if you're seeing the recording, that'll be, again, posted on our FFF email update that we put out every day, 6 days a week. If you're not subscribing to our FFF email update, I'd like to invite you to do so. Free for the asking. And if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and take a look at us. We are a libertarian educational foundation. We present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the free society. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is an area that distinguishes libertarians from both liberals and conservatives. Now, we all know that there are major differences philosophically and program-wise, policy-wise, with respect to libertarians and conservatives and liberals. You know, perhaps the biggest one is the drug war. Liberals and conservatives are statists in this regard. They believe that the state should be, have the power to punish people for ingesting what the majority feels are improper substances. In other words, it's okay if people smoke cigarettes, kill themselves that way, or drink alcohol or whatever. But hey, don't even think about doing it with substances that the majority doesn't approve of. Well, libertarians, of course, take the position that it all ought to be legalized, that this war has been terribly immoral and very destructive. That's one of the major demarcation points. We can look at the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives are all devoted to these programs. They're doing everything they can right now to save them, along with all the other welfare programs. Libertarians say dismantle them, leave people free to keep everything they earn, let them decide what to do with it, leave charity entirely voluntary. And then we've got, of course, the foreign policy arena where there's these major differences. The liberals and the conservatives, again, are statists in this regard. They love the empire. They love the standing army. They love the big military, the militarism that affects our society. They love the empire, thousands, 1,000 bases or so across the world, intervening in foreign affairs, invasions, occupations, bombs, killing, torture, Gitmo. They love it all. They're devoted to it. They're not about to reduce it to any large extent. Libertarians say dismantle the empire, bring all the troops home, discharge them, dismantle the standing army. There's no threat of an invasion or an attack. In other words, restore a limited government republic to our land. So these are some of the major areas of difference, but among these as well is the concept of open borders. And this, as many of you know in the libertarian movement, is a controversial area even within libertarians. There's lots of libertarians that just can't go this far. They can say, well, I can go up to a certain point, but no, man, just open borders, that's just going too far. Well, actually, open borders is the only practical solution to the immigration woes that affect our nation. I mean, that's what I find fascinating is that people that resist this idea think, oh, it's just so impractical and so forth. Actually, it's the exact opposite. It's impractical to continue with the status quo. I mean, that's what's produced all these crises. And so here you have the only solution that will work is open borders. I mean, that resolves the crisis. You look, we've got a huge immigration crisis, right? Well, we've also got a drug war crisis, right? We've got a Social Security crisis. It's bankrupt. There's no fund. There never has been a fund. There's a Medicare crisis. There's a terrorism crisis. There's a Afghanistan crisis, Pakistan, Libya, Gitmo crisis, torture crisis. There's a crisis everywhere, right? Well, what's the common denominator here? Well, of course, it's federal interventionism. Everywhere you look, the society is in crisis, but underlying every one of these crises is federal interventionism or federal welfare statism or federal warfare statism. The dollar, look at the dollar, cratering in international markets. Inflation, out of control government spending, the national debt. Again, the Federal Reserve, the IRS. There's federal government involvement in all these. So why does it surprise anybody that there's an immigration crisis? Well, of course there's an immigration crisis. You've got classic federal socialism and federal interventionism here in the area of the free movements of people and the free movements of goods and services. Now, in previous editions of this program, we've talked about socialism, about how, liberals and conservatives are devoted to socialism and how they just won't let go of it. And despite how bad things get, with the welfare statism and the foreign interventionism and the imperialism, they just love, all the statism, the interventionism, the socialism. But as we've also pointed out in previous shows, there's variations on socialism. I mean, there's different types of socialism. There's the Cuban type socialism, which is complete for all practical purposes. The government, owns everything. They've fulfilled the liberal dream. They've got, the state takes money from one group of people and gives it to another group of people. Well, the Castro regime just took everything from the rich, the homes, the businesses, everything, took it over by the government, and everybody now works for the government. So that's pure socialism, where the government owns everything, the means of production, the results of production, and then it doles out as an allowance what people should have in terms of what their jobs are. And of course, everybody in Cuba works for the state. But there's also the socialism that we have here in the United States, where income is effectively nationalized. The IRS, essentially determines, how much you're going to be able to keep at the end of each year, and you're required to send in whatever the government sends. They do the collecting, and the idea is the government takes money from one group of people, which is, the so-called rich or the middle class, because the middle class pay big taxes, and it's the poor too. And you're taking money from one group of people and you're giving it to another group of people. In other words, the Marxian idea, from each according to ability to each according to need. This is the whole idea of the welfare state, taking from those who have in order to give supposedly to those who need, but usually it's to the privileged buddies of those in office. But there's another aspect of socialism that we've always got to keep in mind, and that's the idea of socialist central planning, where you've got a central board or commission of government officials that are planning in a top-down command and control fashion the peaceful economic activities of multitudes of people. And you look at the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. I mean, they were characterized with this notion of socialist central planning. The government owned the means of production, the industries, and of course, anybody from that region will tell you what it was like. There were shortages and distortions in the market, and people didn't have enough. There were long lines. I mean, you got a hint of it sort of when there were price controls and gasoline, back in the 70s, when you had all the long lines at the filling stations. That's central planning. That's a government deciding what the price of an item is going to be, what the supply is going to be. And of course, you've got all of these perversions and distortions. And that's what happens when government intervenes in the marketplace. Well, that's precisely what's been going on in the immigration field for decades. I mean, you have this classic case of socialist central planning. You've got the socialist central planner, the guy who, Friedrich Hayek, the libertarian Austrian Nobel Prize winning economist, called the person with a pretense of knowledge. That he, the planner or the group of planners, pretends to have the knowledge to plan this complex market activity involving, in this case, millions of people. So what they're going to do is they're going to say, well, we decide what the quota of each country is going to be. In this country, we're going to have this number of people, and these are going to be their qualifications, and this is how much education they have. And of course, they always lean toward the rich, or the well-educated. They're not going to go with the people that are on the statue, that little poem on the Statue of Liberty, the teeming masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your shores. They're not going to go for those. They consider those people riffraff, So they've got these quotas where they have the qualifications and the number and so forth. And they plan these in accordance with what they think is needed in the marketplace. So each country gets its quota, and each country is allocated what number. And if you want to get in the quota, you've got to stand in line. Sometimes they don't get to your application for years. Well, what does it do? Well, it creates all of these distortions in the marketplace. I mean, for example, up here you may have farmers that desperately need, people to harvest their crop right now. Well, that's not going to fit within the planner's time framework. He says, well, no, just stand in line, and we'll get to you in about maybe 4 or 5 years. And when the guy that wants to come and work says, well, wait, you don't understand. They have a crop that needs to be done right now. The planner says, oh, we totally understand. That's not our concern. Our concern is our rules and our regulations and our plan. You see, for the planner, everything is the plan. And so you end up with these weird quota numbers and qualifications stuff that don't ever fit market conditions. And as soon as they make a plan, it's out of date anyway. I mean, that's the central fault of central planning is that they cannot ever have the requisite knowledge to adjust for constantly changing market conditions, because people's subjective valuations change on a momentary basis. In a marketplace, the indicator of that, the messenger of that, of course, is the price system. If prices are rising in Montana for labor, nobody needs to know why that is. Nobody has to do a study or bring together a commission and wonder why the price of labor is rising in Montana. All that workers need to know is that price is rising. And then they, of course, consider it in their interest. They have to do some calculation, and they say, okay, this is how much it's going to cost me to get up there. But yeah, this is worth it. Man, they're offering wages that are unbelievable. I'm on my way up there. The central planner can't keep up with the price system. As soon as the central planner comes up with a plan, it's outdated immediately because of the constantly shifting valuations of people. And that's why there's always a crisis in immigration. Just always, because of these distortions and these perversions and so forth. And so, it's kind of ironic that people say, oh, we have to look to the federal government. The Congress has to come and solve the crisis, and so it's got to do something. Well, the problem is that they are the root of the problem. I mean, it's like saying the government needs to win the war on drugs. Well, we libertarians know that's ludicrous. There's only one way to win the war on drugs, and that's just to get rid of the war, because that's what's causing the problem. You just legalize it, and then you got no more drug lords, you got no more distortions and perversions in the drug market, you don't have all the violence, the gang wars, the cartels, the 35,000 deaths in Mexico. It's the same thing with the war on immigrants. That the way to resolve the problem is not by coming up with some kind of reform plan and a new plan and so forth. The way to resolve the problem is end the war. Just legalize the free movements of goods and services across borders, and you resolve the problem. And that's the only way to resolve the problem. Because what inevitably happens is that you end up with a situation where the government is intervening with some kind of reform to fix the problems associated with the previous reform. Right? And all they do is just make things worse and worse and worse. You've seen this decade after decade after decade in the immigration field. I mean, originally they start out with, okay, it's illegal to cross the border into the United States without permission. All right, so that's their first rule. Well, except they notice a problem immediately, and that is that people aren't complying with the rule. Let's keep in mind that the states of Texas, Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona, California, parts of Colorado, Nevada, this was all the northern half of Mexico at one time. I mean, this was Mexico. This was Mexican language, Spanish. It was a Spanish culture. I mean, it had been under the flag of Spain for a couple centuries or so. It had been under Indian control even before that. The culture, the language, the laws, everything was Mexico. So, it's not surprising that people who had been accustomed to traveling in their own country for centuries, going back centuries, would still have the ties to their country simply because all of a sudden the United States decides to voluntarily absorb the entire northern half of this country. And they absorb it, by incorporating everybody into the country. I mean, every Mexican citizen that was living in the northern half of his country was automatically given American citizenship overnight, and all the lands now fall under the jurisdiction of the United States. So they when they enact this intervention and they say, okay, well, no more crossing the border. Nobody pays attention to it, because even for some, when they took over the northern half of Mexico, this was in 1848 at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The people from that point on to around the 1930s or so, there was open borders there. I mean, that always shocks Americans to learn that there was just absolutely open borders. Why? Because even though the United States absorbed the northern half of Mexico, they sort of left the situation alone with respect to the free movements of people back and forth. Now, sovereignty changed, the laws changed, the court system changed, because now you're dealing with the United States. But Mexicans were free to come in here the way that they had come in here before the treaty. They could invest their money. They could open up businesses. Just come on over, open up a business. Provide your goods and services. You're a Mexican citizen, and you're living in the United States, but they were still this free movement of goods and services across the borders. And then one day, they make it illegal, but people still cross. So now they need a new intervention, and so they say, oh well, we need border controls at the crossing points, the bridges, or whatever, the roads that cross the border, and we need to check people's identification and they figured, oh, well, that'll solve the problem. And, of course, that didn't work, because then people just circumvent the border controls. And so then that requires new interventions, okay? Now you got to have border patrols, patrolling all along the border. You got to cross onto people's property, private property, trespass. You got federal gendarmes that are going into people's private property in order to, quote, check the border. And, of course, that didn't work either. And I remember that back, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, where they made it illegal to hire illegal aliens, you see. And I remember them saying that this is going to solve the problem once and for all, because if illegal aliens can't get a job, they won't come over. And this was just, many in a series of previous interventions. But prior to that intervention, it was entirely legal for Americans to hire illegal aliens. I grew up on the Rio Grande, on a farm that adjoined the Rio Grande. We hired illegal aliens. I grew up with them. The hardest working people I've ever seen. Strong family values. They would send a large portion of money back to their wives and their children and their mother and father, and they were taking care of their families. They were, by and large, very religious people. I mean, they had the kind of values that you would think that Americans would hold dear. But in any event, they passed this, most recent, the newest intervention at that time. We're going to make it illegal to hire these people. And, of course, that didn't work. And, and I predicted at the time that it wasn't going to work because none of these interventions work. They just create new distortions, new perversions. You had people now transporting illegal aliens. They made that illegal, illegal to transport illegal aliens. That didn't work because, it's like the drug war. As you made it more illegal and you enforced it more and you increased the penalty, more and more people would get into the business, more money to be made, the profit incentive, the black market. And the interventions kept going on. You've got these raids on American businesses. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. You feel like you're in the Soviet Union sometime when you see these raids. And then, of course, they've got that ridiculous wall down there that, well, we call it the Berlin Fence because it resembles the Berlin Wall. I still don't know why conservatives were celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, it seems to me like they'd have been much better off and more consistent with their philosophy just to move it. to move the Berlin Wall over to the southern border of the United States and maybe even hire some East German sharpshooters. Well, except that I guess they don't want to hire foreigners and take jobs away from Americans. They could hire, the U.S. military to man the Berlin Wall down there. I still don't understand why they didn't do that. But instead, they built this ridiculous Berlin fence that, they showed, there's a YouTube picture showing where, the illegal aliens put up a ladder and were able to scale this thing within about 10 seconds. And of course, it's affecting the ecology. It's screwing up people's private property. Some people have their ranches and their farms, with the fence in the middle of the property, so that the other side of the property, the other side of the fence, is still on the American side of the border. But this is just part and parcel of all these interventions. And remember, they used to say that the wall would take care of everything. Remember, this was the final solution to all this stuff. Well, of course, it's never a final solution. There's always an immigration crisis. I mean, every 3 or 4 years, people start going nuts. I mean, like they're doing in Arizona, the immigration crisis, and then all the mainstream media joins in and chimes in with all their reform plans, and this is what needs to be done, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous because it will not work. It can never work. This is why I keep saying to people, I've said it for decades, that if you want to be practical, don't be calling for immigration reform, because that is not practical. That is doing the same thing you've been doing for decades. And we know that saying about insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But that's what they keep doing with this immigration. Interventionism, interventionism, interventionism. It's not the only place we've seen it. We see it with the drug war. We see it with public government schooling, another area of socialist central planning. We see it with Social Security, the central planning of people's retirement, or healthcare. We see it in healthcare. Always. Interventionism, interventionism. We need a new reform. We need a new reform. And this will be the one that's going to solve the problem. It will never solve the problem. Okay, now that's the most important thing. If you don't get any message from me, any other message, get this one. No matter what these people do, the statists, liberals and conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, doesn't matter what they do, there's still going to be a crisis in immigration. 3 or 4 years down the line, we're going to be hearing about the immigration crisis again. I mean, they'd almost be better off doing nothing, because their interventions just make things worse. But there's only one solution, and that's to end the war on immigrants, to end the socialist central planning, to end the central planning of immigration, to open up the borders to the free movements of people. Now, let me talk a little bit about liberals in this regard, because this is near and dear to my heart. Those of you that have been listening to this program know that I've taken conservatives to task for their hypocrisy from time to time, and deservedly so. I mean, conservatives and Republicans, they do suffer from hypocrisy. For example, the idea of free enterprise, private property, and limited government, right? I mean, isn't that the standard conservative mantra? Free enterprise, private property, and limited government. Go to any conservative foundation, think tank, go to their website, go to their stationery, their speeches, their debates, their programs. They're all somewhere in there you're going to hear or read free enterprise, private property, and limited government. It's like their little mantra. They feel like they have to throw it out, all the time. And of course, then when you ask them, but how do you resolve this with your support of the drug war, the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, foreign aid, the empire, invasions, wars of aggression, Gitmo, and whatever, they can't do it. And that's why they kind of resent us libertarians, because we show them that their support of programs violate their mantras and violate their supposed principles. But liberals are no different, and they have their little area of hypocrisy too. And the reason I say it's near and dear to my heart is that, I grew up as a liberal. I grew up as a Democrat there in South Texas. And when I got home to practice law in my hometown, I believe in this notion that government should help the poor. And it just befuddled me that anybody would object to why government should help the poor. And I figured, well, this is what liberals are about. They're about helping the poor, and they have a care and compassion for the poor. And then one day it hit me. I was representing illegal aliens. I was going to the detention center. I was empathizing with these guys. I mean, they hadn't done anything wrong except work for a living, seek a better way of life, and they were just sitting in this detention center waiting for their case to be heard and waiting to be deported. I mean, it was just a travesty. And it just hit me one day. If liberals love the poor so much, how could they be doing this to these people? Because you couldn't find poorer people than these. I mean, this was the poor of the poor. These people had nothing. They were coming up here risking their lives, risking everything, leaving their families, just to work, just to make some money. And liberals were putting them in jail. And I went and started talking to some of my liberal friends, and they didn't have any good answers for this. And that's when I finally figured out that these people, they're hypocrites. I mean, the liberals are hypocrites. They've been waging this war on immigrants as much as the conservatives have. Now, the conservatives, they don't make any bones. They don't like immigrants. They like waging the war on immigrants. They'd build a Berlin Wall around the whole United States. They'd isolate the whole United States if they could. Not the military. They want the military to go all over the world. But the American people, they want to isolate us from the rest of the world, and that's what these walls are about. But liberals profess to love the poor. And how many times when we libertarians say it's time to dismantle these socialist programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, welfare, foreign aid, what do liberals say? Oh, you hate the poor, you hate the needy, you hate the disadvantaged. Right? I mean, isn't that their standard accusation against libertarians? But whenever a liberal does that, ask him, where do you stand on open borders? And man, he will turn red, beat red in the face. He will get flustered because he can't say anything. All he can say is, well, the law is the law. Well, yeah, but did you ever try to get the law changed? Democrats held control of Congress. They had control of the presidency for many times during the past several decades. They could have repealed these laws. They could have ended this tyranny, this oppression, but they didn't because they believe in waging war against the poorest of the poor, raiding businesses, rounding up poor people, dividing their families, deporting those that are not Americans, leaving their children or possibly their wife who happens to be an American over here. This is what the liberals stand for. And whenever you hear a liberal saying, oh, I'm a compassionate person, I love the poor, all you got to do is think, well, where do you stand on the war on immigrants, the war on the poorest people in the world? And by golly, I will guarantee you that liberal will have nothing to say. He will just walk away because you've exposed him. You've exposed his hypocrisy, his double standard. And, you've exposed the fact that his support of the welfare state is not because he loves the poor, the needy, and the disadvantaged. It's because he, like the conservatives, loves money and power. The welfare state brings power over people. It brings people to make people dependent on the government. More deference to authority, to the authority of the federal government. And it brings money. For the party that's in power, it brings largesse. What does the welfare state spend? A couple $1 trillion? That's a lot of largesse. And of course, then you've got the military largesse too, which is really a form of welfare. But this is where the double standard of the liberals are, the hypocrisy, the double dealing. It's exposed in this war on immigrants. Now, you might ask, well, Jacob, is there any example of where you have open borders? Well, yeah. I mean, I gave you an example a little while ago of the southern border. I mean, that was a totally open border for some 50, 60 years or so. And keep in mind that Americans voluntarily absorbed the northern half of Mexico. People say, oh, we couldn't handle all these illegal aliens coming in here. Well, somehow or another, the American ancestors of ours, they handled the entire northern half of Mexico. And they voluntarily absorbed it together with all the people. So there's one example. And Ellis Island, for all practical purposes, there was no control there. I mean, that's what distinguished America from the rest of the world. The rest of the world has always had immigration controls. So, when you hear people today, Americans today, saying, we've got to be more like Europe, we've got to be more like Asia, they have immigration controls. Well, duh. I mean, that's what has characterized the lands of statism for centuries. They've had statism, they've had socialism, they've had imperialism, they've had empires. Yeah, but what distinguished America from the rest of the world is that we didn't have those kind of things. That's what made America exceptional, because it was the exception to the statism from around the world. And at Ellis Island, the only real control there was a tuberculosis type control to make sure somebody didn't have some infectious diseases. But other than that, people were free to come into this country. I mean, it was effectively a totally open border. I mean, that's why the Statue of Liberty came over here. That's why that mantra there, give us the wretched refuge of your teeming shores, your masses yearning to breathe free. Because the poorest of the poor were coming over here. I mean, if you want to talk about compassion for the poor and love of the poor and so forth, this was it. I mean, it was just like open borders for anybody coming over here. So, there is an example, but it's not the only example. I mean, look here inside the United States. Here in the United States, we have the greatest free trade and open movements of people zone in history. And I'm talking about the domestic United States. I'm talking about crossing state boundaries. I mean, you've got people can go 3,000 miles without seeing an immigration official or a trade official, with trade quotas and trade deficits and all that. I mean, think about it. Do you know what the trade deficit is between, let's say, Virginia and Florida? I mean, do you know that one state is selling more than the other way around? In other words, if there's a trade deficit between Virginia and Florida, I mean, does that cause you to lose sleep at night, to start pacing the floors of, oh my gosh, the trade deficit between Virginia and Florida, oh my gosh, the one of those states is going to fall into the ocean, they're going to end up with nothing, they're going to end up impoverished because the deficit keeps getting larger? No, you don't even think about it. You don't even know what the trade figures are between Florida and Virginia. You don't care. All that matters is the people are pursuing their own happiness. Could be that Virginians are all going down and spending every dime they have at Disney World, and that all those Floridians are retired down there and enjoying themselves, and they ain't coming up to Virginia. Who cares? Nobody cares. Nobody's sitting here saying, oh my gosh, Virginia's going to go under because of the trade deficit. It's a nonsensical notion. Same thing here in between Virginia and Maryland. Every day, thousands of people, we don't even know because nobody's keeping count, of Marylanders cross into Virginia. Thousands of Virginians cross into Maryland. No one knows what the numbers are. Nobody keeps count. They could be coming over here taking jobs from Virginians, or Virginians may be going over there and selling things at a lower price than Marylanders. Nobody cares. You see, there's no statistics. There's nobody, central planner, keeping track. Now, it didn't have to be that way. Thank goodness for the founding fathers and the framers who made it unconstitutional for the states to put up immigration and trade restrictions. Because I guarantee you, if they hadn't done that with the Constitution, we would have trade restrictions and immigration controls between each state. Because the high welfare states like California would say, we're overcrowded, and if we don't have immigration controls here, people are going to be flooding into California to get on welfare. And, you'd have New York saying, oh, we got too many people in New York City, we're not going to allow anybody from Montana to move into New York. Oh, vice versa, yeah, so you have immigration controls. You'd have trade restrictions, with every state, having to negotiate trade treaties between each state to lower the trade barriers and so forth. None of that exists, thanks to our American ancestors who said, we ain't going to have that. And so you have this free trade and free movements of people that, hey, by the way, is a major factor in a higher standard of living. That when people are free to trade including trading their labor services. And they're free to move without, some central planner having to write out a permit or give you permission to go from Montana to New Orleans in the event of an emergency. You get down there and you can make business opportunities. Labor prices are going up. Go down there to work. You don't have to check with anybody. You just go in this country. So there's none of these controls. But it wouldn't have to be that way. I mean, let's say the Constitution was amended to allow each state to do that. Well, many of the statists, their position would be, oh, boy, that would be tremendous economic prosperity for every state. Man, erecting walls, Berlin walls all around each state, man, that would be the key to financial and economic prosperity. And how do we know they would say that? Because that's what they say with respect to the United States. They say, oh, when we have barriers to trade and to the movements of people, that leads to more prosperity here in the United States. Well, then logically, the same principle should apply to the states. That if that's true, if that principle's true, then the statists should be arguing to amend the Constitution and allow each state to erect border controls, Berlin walls, tariffs, trade restrictions, and so forth, in order to make each state rich. Well, instinctively, we know that's nonsense. That would be the worst thing we could possibly do in this country. It would ensure impoverishment. When you start isolating people like this. Well, the same principle applies internationally. Now another example we've seen in this area is the European Union. I mean, for years, the statists said the same things that they say, with respect to the United States. That, oh, if you open the borders, you lose the borders. The borders disappear. There's no more borders. That's a favorite one, right? No more borders. No more borders. Oh, the people that call for open borders are against borders. It's just nonsense. I mean, they're talking to themselves because no libertarian says that. The freedom to cross a border does not mean that a border disappears. It means that people are free to cross it. You see, but the statists jump to the conclusion, well, if a person is free to cross from Virginia into Maryland, that must mean that there's no more border between Virginia and Maryland. No, the border remains. It's the Potomac River. It stays right there. Well, the same thing with respect to Mexico and the United States. If people are free to cross the border, the Rio Grande doesn't disappear. It stays there, and people are free to cross it. That's what happened in the European Union, that people were free all of a sudden to go from Italy to France to Germany without any controls anymore. I mean, it was phenomenal, where, an Italian can just go into France and get a job. And he didn't need to go through all the restrictions that had previously been the case, to protect each country from the competition of people from the other country. They finally saw how ludicrous that was. Let the citizens of each country go back and forth, seeking out their jobs, tourism, visiting, whatever, but they retain their citizenship. So an Italian goes into France, he may get a job, or he may go to school. He retains his Italian citizenship. He's just an Italian living in France. Or a Frenchman that goes into Germany. He may get there to work and whatever, but he doesn't have to show IDs at the borders anymore. He just crosses the border freely. The borders don't disappear. They remain intact. The sovereignty remains. That's another favorite one you hear. Oh, sovereignty will be lost. That's ludicrous. When somebody from Maryland goes into Virginia, he is now subject to the sovereignty of Virginia. He can't, go, speeding around and say, well, no, in Maryland it's okay to speed, No, because he's subject to the laws of Virginia as soon as he crosses into Virginia. Virginia retains sovereignty over its jurisdiction, even though somebody has crossed into Virginia from another state. Same thing with respect to countries. If an Italian guy that goes into France, he's subject to French law. We can't say, oh, no, you can't do this to me because in Italy we do it this way. No, they're going to tell you, we don't care how you do it in Italy. Once you came here, you came at your own risk and subject to our laws. And that's essentially the way open borders work. So, the way to imagine this thing is imagine, you have tourists coming from Germany, France, Mexico, El Salvador, and coming into the United States. They're subject to the criminal laws against murder, rape, stealing, whatever. And if they violate those laws, then they have to pay the penalty. By the same token, Americans that travel into foreign countries, they have the same situation. So, that little myth of, oh, the border disappears is ridiculous. Another one is, oh, they're going to steal jobs away from Americans. You hear that often. Well, that's ludicrous. Historically, you see that open borders, open immigration, increase job opportunities, especially for a well-educated populace, which Americans are. I mean, it's really amazing to see Americans scared to death of competition from people that can't speak English, that are not very well educated. I mean, it's just astounding. Ironically, by the way, Mexicans are just as scared of competition from American businessmen because American businessmen, by and large, are very efficient producers. And they go down into Mexico or into these foreign countries with their business models, and they outcompete many times the Mexicans, and they're just scared to death of that competition. That's the mindset still is the same sort of the American people. They're scared to death of these illegal aliens are going to come over and steal their jobs. Well, there may be some job displacement in certain sectors, but what inevitably happens is that the new economic vibrancy that the immigrant brings, because he needs housing, he needs an automobile, he needs clothing, he needs to buy things for his children, that economic vibrancy produces the demand that then draws the people that have been displaced in that sector into higher paying jobs. The automobile industry, the housing industry, or whatever. And so inevitably the educated American, the one that can speak English, he's going to be attracted into the higher paying jobs that are many times produced by this economic vibrancy from the immigrant. So there's actually economic prosperity, the standard of living actually increases with immigration. There's a division of labor where, each person is doing what he is suited best, and instead of trying to do a bunch of things, he concentrates on what he's able to do best, and therefore, relatively speaking, he's able to increase his income as compared to trying to do 10 or 15 things that now the immigrant's doing. Historically, we see this, in the 19th century, the standard of living of the United States just soared. And this was in large part because thousands of penniless immigrants were flooding American shores every day. They were bringing this vibrancy, this division of labor, this enterprise attitude, entrepreneurship, work ethic. Now, granted, there were other factors that led to the massive accumulation of capital and wealth. There was no income tax, no IRS, no welfare, no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no socialism to speak of. There was no drug war, there was no empire, there was no militarism, no standing army. So there wasn't this huge drain, no Federal Reserve, no paper money. They had gold and silver coins. So you had this confluence of events. I think it's the most remarkable period in the history of man, where you had open immigration, no income tax, no Federal Reserve, no paper money, solid money, gold and silver coins. It was a phenomenal period, and it's not surprising that for the first time in history, the poor were becoming wealthy, and including the immigrants. A lot of the immigrants became wealthy, not immediately, because you had a poor nation in the late 1700s, but over the course of a century, where you had massive accumulations of capital, notwithstanding slavery and the Civil War and a lot of other exceptions, you had a massive increase in the standard of living. Despite what those statists tell you about the Industrial Revolution, because they're always comparing the Industrial Revolution to the standard of living of today. What they've got to be doing is comparing it to the period before that, the centuries before that, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. Another myth is they say, oh, they're going to ruin our culture. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, our culture as Americans is freedom. I mean, that's our heritage. It's a culture of diversity. You got places like New Orleans, a French culture. You got New York, which is a confluence of cultures, Chinatown and Little Italy and so forth. You've got San Francisco with, the Asian influence there. In the Southwest, you've got the Mexican, Spanish, Indian influence. A good example of this is, right now you've got more than 1 million Americans living in Mexico. All right, and many, I read recently that many Americans just won't learn English. They all hang out among themselves. They won't assimilate. They cheer for American sports teams, if you can believe that. They won't give up their American citizenship. They just retired there, and they just want to live their lives in peace. And well, I say great. I think it's wonderful. Leave them alone. But the statists would say, oh no, they're treasonous. They're unpatriotic. They should become Mexican citizens. They should cheer for the Mexican sports teams. That's ludicrous. And by the same token, Mexicans that come here, or El Salvadorians or French, whether as tourists or as immigrants, they want to cheer for their home country. Big deal. They're in no different position than an American living in Paris rooting for the Dallas Cowboys, or some American soccer team against the international soccer team. It's no different from people in a state rooting for their football team, or people in the state rooting for the football team in the state from where they came from. This is what freedom is all about. It's the diversity, the difference in cultures and so forth. They say, oh, well, they don't speak English. Well, immigrants have never spoken English. The statists have said this about immigrants since the beginning. The first generation always has a hard time, or not always, but usually have a very difficult time with the English. They speak to their families and their friends. That's why there's Little Italy. That's why there's Chinatown. They speak in the native tongue. The second generation, the children of the immigrant, they're bilingual usually. They can speak both languages because they learn the native language in the home. The third generation, usually it's only English. And so you got, people that look Asian or they look Hispanic and they can't speak a word of Japanese or Chinese or Spanish. And they're kind of embarrassed to their grandparents because they have this thick accent or they can't speak English. But this is just the way things are. I mean, it's not something to lament and get all upset about it. It's the way things have always been. I mean, who cares what language a person speaks? That's really up to them. I mean, nobody forces you to go and speak to somebody. If they can't speak in a language that's satisfactory to you, you don't need to talk to them. I told you I grew up on the border. I would say in Laredo, where I grew up, about 98% is Hispanic. I mean, why would that surprise anybody? This was Mexico. I mean, things don't change even that significantly over the course of a century. Everybody's still going to be the same families, in other words. There's some intermarriage with Anglos and stuff, like my mother did with my father. But, by and large, things don't change that much. When I was practicing law, and the jury panel would come in, and they'd have to be qualified to serve on the jury, I would say easily 25% of the jury panel could not speak or write in the English language. And everybody was very courteous. The judge was courteous. The judge was bilingual usually, but he was very courteous to them. Nobody insulted them or said, oh, you're stupid or you're dumb or, oh, you're an American and you can't even speak English. Nobody cared, It's like, okay, well, thank you for coming and we'll excuse you from jury service. I mean, there was a harmony of interest down there that to me is sort of a model for America. I mean, if you've never been to the border areas, it's really worth a trip down there because it's a totally different culture. I mean, you want to talk about culture shock. Whenever the statists say we need to purify America, we need to get rid of all the Hispanic signs and we need to speak English and so forth. They never tell you what they're going to do with the border because, half the people down there are speaking Spanish in the stores and so forth. The signs are in Spanish. Even some cities are in Spanish. San Francisco, that's Spanish. San Diego, El Paso, Laredo, San Antonio. I mean, you've got these places, and this is part of our culture. It's not something to lament. It's something to celebrate. People say, oh, what about the terrorism? What about the terrorism? Well, the root of the terrorism, again, is the federal government. I mean, that's the root of the problem. That's what's causing the terrorism. It's not hatred for America's freedom and values. It's the empire. If you have an empire overseas, you're going to have bad consequences. The same way if you have a drug war, you're going to have bad consequences. If you have public schooling, you're going to have bad consequences. If you have a war on immigrants, immigration controls, you're going to have bad consequences. If you have Social Security, you're going to have bad consequences. So the terrorism is just the blowback, the retaliation for the bad things that the U.S. government is doing overseas. The best thing you could ever do to end terrorism is just dismantle the empire. Bring the troops home. stop them from doing bad things to people. And then your terrorism disappears. And of course, you also save a lot of money, because we all know the government's going bankrupt with all the money it's paying, and these overseas bases and the torture centers they have, and the torture partnerships and the support of the dictatorships in the Middle East, and the occupations and the invasions and attacks and bombs. They're running out of bombs. I saw with NATO, and the U.S. might have to replenish their bombs. And well, if you want to get rid of terrorism, that's the route. But if you say, well, no, I want the empire, and I want the wars of aggression, and I want the invasion, I want the torture, I want to be able to do these things to these people, I want my government to be able to do these things. Okay, well then how do you solve this problem where people are going to come and retaliate? Because they are. I mean, you just got to accept that. And, well, do you want the government to spy on everybody? Because that's not very efficient. Because 98% of the people crossing into the United States are just perfectly legal people. I mean, peaceful, law-abiding people. No, what you want to do is concentrate your limited resources for the police on the people that are committing the crimes. The same way we do in traditional law enforcement, on murder and rape and stealing. We don't want the government monitoring all of us, spying on all of us and listening to our telephone calls in order to figure out those 2% or whatever the number is of committing crimes. No, we want the police to concentrate on the people committing the crimes, investigate those, bring those people to justice. It's no different with respect to terrorism. That concentrate your limited resources on the people that are coming in here to do harm in a violent sense. Then you've got scarce resources concentrated on the people that are actually doing harm. But when you take your scarce resources and you just spread them out to millions of people, 98% of whom are doing nothing wrong, well, then of course you're making life more dangerous for you. Not only because the government's dangerous in terms of spying and monitoring on people, but it's not catching the culprits as efficiently as if it hones its resources in on those who are committing the crimes. Finally, another thing they say is, they're coming on welfare, Jacob, they're coming on welfare. We libertarians hear that all the time, They're coming to get on welfare. Well, for one thing, it's just not true. Immigrants come here to work. Have you ever heard of a raid on a welfare center? No, never. You have never heard of an immigration raid on a welfare center. Why? Because they ain't there. Why are the raids always on businesses? Because that's where they are. That's where the immigrants are. They're working. And sure enough, that's why they come here, to work, to make money, to send money back to their families. They're not about to, especially on an illegal basis, to walk into some center and give their name and say, I came here for welfare, It's ridiculous. I mean, they don't want to have anything to do with the authority because the authority means deportation. So this is just a myth that people use as an excuse. It's an excuse. That things are going bad in the economy. Why? Well, again, the government, the welfare state, the warfare state, the out-of-control spending. That's what's the root of the economic crisis as well. So we've got the terrorist crisis, the drug war crisis, the economic crisis, the dollar crisis. It's all rooted in a massive federal government and massive federal interventionism. People look for scapegoats when things are going bad. And the most popular scapegoat, of course, is the illegal alien, the immigrant, because he generally can't defend himself. But, my position, I always tell libertarians, look, we stand for some really strong moral principles with libertarianism. I mean, we have a consistent philosophy. We stand for moral principles. We stand for pragmatic principles. And here in the immigration field is a perfect example of that. I mean, you've got the moral case, the religious case, love thy neighbor as thyself. And you have the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat your fellow man decently. So we do that. That's why we oppose these raids. That's why we oppose these immigration controls. We believe in the freedom of contract, where people should be free to hire whomever they want. I mean, it's their business. It's their money. They should be able to enter into any mutual beneficial exchange. It means higher prosperity, more economic prosperity for everybody, including the poor person that wants to come over and work. And so we have a beautiful philosophy, this libertarian philosophy. We ought to take a lot of pride in it. And the worst thing we can do is to join the statists on any aspect of statism. And so when people say, well, Jacob, suppose they are coming for welfare, then should we become a statist now? Should we join the statists? No. Don't let them maneuver you into joining them. Because the worst thing to do is to become a statist on any aspect of statism. You know, it's like the drug war. Oh, well, should we support the drug war until they repeal Medicare and Medicaid? Because the drug users will go on Medicare and Medicaid? No. You oppose the drug war because it's the right thing to do. And you oppose these immigration controls. I mean, you know, hey, look, we all know the statists don't like immigrants. And so what better way to get rid of the welfare state than to have immigrants coming in and getting on welfare? I mean, the first thing the statists are going to do is to say we need to get rid of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and welfare and so forth because we don't want our hard-earned tax money to be going to these foreigners. Well, wouldn't that be a good result? Because, you know, I don't like my hard-earned money taken by force by the IRS and given to other people. Doesn't matter to me whether it's an American. I'm still resented, you know, or whether he's a Marylander or a California. Still wrong. And so we can't compromise our principles or really abandon our principles. We stand for freedom of association as libertarians, freedom of contract, the freedom to do what you want with your own money. And, of course, the moral case of treating people decently, treating them according to biblical principles. And finally, you know, we've got to talk about the police-state aspect of all this. That, you know, when you go down to the border, if you're doing, I highly recommend it. It's a fascinating way of life down there, culturally and in every which way. You're going to see the police-state Soviet Union-style checkpoints. And these are north of the border, like north of Laredo, like about 30 miles. They're at the airport where the Border Patrol is. Now, they will ask people for their papers. Now, I'm talking about people that never cross into Mexico. I'm not talking about the bridge. You know, at the bridges there, they ask you for your identification. When you're crossing across the Rio Grande from Mexico into Laredo, they're gonna stop you there. I mean, it looks like a regular checkpoint. I'm talking about north of the border, like 30 miles. You know, let's say you come down to Laredo to visit, and you say, I don't want to go into Mexico because the drug war is causing, you know, these 35,000 deaths and kidnappings and so forth, and too dangerous. I'm just going to look around Laredo, stay here a couple nights, head back up to San Antonio. You encounter a Soviet Union-style checkpoint where they have full rights to check your vehicle, open your trunk, search your car. If somebody's planted drugs in your car, you're out of luck because they're going to charge you with drug possession. And that's not all of it. When you start heading east-west on the highways, they've got checkpoints there too. And so you'll come over the crest of a hill, let's say in Arizona, and all of a sudden there's this huge, surreal-type Soviet Union-type checkpoint. Well, that's what this has all brought us. It's brought us this police-state environment, and it's now moving up north because from what I hear, these checkpoints are now moving up in Northern California and Washington State and so forth. And then, of course, you've got the roving Border Patrol checkpoints where they just stop people indiscriminately and search their cars. This is not what America's supposed to be all about. And part of this show, is those of you who watch, is that I keep emphasizing the importance of libertarians raising people's vision to a higher level here, to break out of this box of statism on the drug war, the welfare state, the warfare state. Don't get mired down in coming up with reform plans for Social Security and Medicare and the drug war and the empire and how to save Iraq and how to save Afghanistan and Pakistan and Libya and how we can reform the war on immigrants. Don't get mired down in all that. Raise people's vision to a higher level, to a society based on freedom and free markets and free movements of people and private property and freedom of contract and freedom of association, moral principles. That's what makes us libertarians different. And if we stand by our principles, we can't guarantee that we're going to be successful, but it's the best chance we have. And then the choice, of course, then remains with other people, but at least we remain true to our principles and our beliefs. That's the show this week. Nice to be with you again. Look forward to talking to you next week. Bye-bye.